Welcome and thanks for joining today. My name is Kevin Holman. I'm a member of the Superload Bentley Connect Edition routing team, and I'm here today to demonstrate the Connect Edition of Superload routing. I'm using an internal site, which is a development and QA site. It's not a production site. It's modeled after the site that was implemented for Maryland. And what you see here on the screen is the trip page. It's got three different components. We have a map on the right-hand side. We've got a panel over here on the left, which is where users interact with the map and the application. And I'll go through all this in a bit more. And then up at the top, we have a summary bar. And in this particular case, this displays the truck information that was previously entered. So we have the vehicle height, width, length, and GVW. We also have the ability to show more detailed information. So here we have the axle load information. This particular truck has 5 axles. And this is the spacing information that I previously entered. Details about the axle can be accessed this way. In addition, we have a schematic for the truck as well. So it shows the 5 axles, the spacing information as well. And we do this for a couple of reasons. One is that we've learned from our users that sometimes they get to this page and they've forgotten what truck dimensions were entered. So this gives you the ability to quickly look at that without having to leave the page and review that. And it's just part of one of our design principles, which is to present as much data as possible and provide flexibility to access that data. That's that part. I'll also like to talk about this map view on the right. This can be resized. It's dynamic, so you can change the size of this map view just by dragging this window across. It's very similar to the maps that we're all familiar with because of Google Maps. So it's a dynamic map. I'm moving this around just by using my mouse. We can zoom in. I'm using my scroll bar on my mouse to zoom in. And just like Google Maps or Bing Maps, you can see the updated map display. In addition to that, you can zoom in and zoom out through these icons here over on the left. We've got the ability to fit features. So a feature would be something which is displayed on top of this map. It could be a bridge symbol, it could be a city outline, it could be a particular route. And this little tool will change the extent of the window to fit all those features in the view. We also have the ability to clear those features. So if you've highlighted a bunch of bridges and you no longer want to see those, you can use this tool to remove those from the display. This is very similar as well. Once you've defined a trip and displayed it, if for some reason you no longer want to view it or you want to enter a new trip, you can use this icon here to clear that trip from the display. The view you're seeing here is what we refer to as our Streets view. It's the default view that users get when they first enter the application. There's 4 base map views that can be chosen. So this is the Streets view. There's also a high contrast view, and that's used primarily for people that have some sort of vision impairment or perhaps red-green color blindness. There's also an outdoors view, which is similar to the Streets view, just a little bit less vivid. And then finally, we have a satellite view. So this shows raster satellite imagery as well as the streets. And the choice to use any of these is by user, and your preference is saved. So the last view you've used, that will be the view you'll see when you first return to the map. So I'm going to use the Streets view because that's the one that I just generally use most oftenly. And as I mentioned before, we have this panel on the left-hand side, and this contains the portion of the application where you'd actually interact with the map. We have 4 different panels. The first one is the trip definition panel. This allows you to enter a trip that you later will evaluate and analyze. I'll go through all this in detail in a second. The second panel has some miscellaneous commands. And the third panel has some just listing of various tools that are in addition to trip definition and the trip commands. And then the final panel will display the results, directions, and summary information from a trip analysis. So we have 5 different ways of entering a trip, and I'll just briefly discuss those, and then I'll give you an example of each of these as we go along. The first method is called enter a trip, and that you use that when you know the trip you want to travel, and you just want the system to check that trip for safe travel, to check the bridges and restrictions along that trip. So using that method, you would specify the various routes, the turns, and then once that's been entered, then you would verify that trip. Generate trip works differently. Generate trip, you specify a start location and an end location, and then you ask the system to find a safe route of travel from start to end. It's very similar to what you would do when finding trip directions in Google Maps. The third way of entering trip is what we call pick a trip on the map. And using this method, you actually click the map along the route and the various route segments and intersections that you want to travel. So you define that graphically using the map to define the trip. The fourth method is what we call load a safe trip. So if you have trips that you commonly use, for example, interstate route from border to border, then you can define that trip, you can save those trips, and then later you can recall those trips without having to redefine them. You just load that trip and then analyze it with your currently defined truck. And then finally we have freeform route entry method, and that's kind of a last resort, and that method would be used when every other method has been unsuccessful for some reason. Perhaps you want to travel on a county road which isn't in the system, and using freeform entry you would just type in the description of the route you want to travel. That would be sent to the permit office, and then they would help you find that trip. So I'll start the demonstration using generate a trip. And as I mentioned before, this method allows you to find a method from a start to an end location. And a location can be defined in one of 3 ways. You can define it by picking a location on the map, by using an address, and we have a drop-down list of addresses that get displayed, or you can use text entry through this text box here. So I'll begin by demonstrating the text entry, and this uses a feature that we refer to internally as Smart Locate. So all that you need to do here is start typing the name of a route or a route number. So for example, if I type the number 7, I'm going to see a list of all the routes in the state that have the number 7 in their name. And that list gets filtered as I type. So here we just have the routes that have 70 in the name, and so the list is dynamic as you type. So I'm going to start today, I'm just typing letter A, and as you see the list drops down, and I'm going to pick Aspen Hill Road. And I'll pick the first location. So we're going to start this trip today on Aspen Hill Road at Adrian Street. Click Add, and the map will be zooming to that location. So if you look right here, there's Aspen Hill Road, there's Adrian Street. That's where the trip is starting. And today I'll end on I-70. And what you see here, once again, is a list of smart locations. So this data is populated from your source data. So as part of the implementation process, we import your source data and generate the data to support these lists. And these location lists include, in the case of Maryland, city streets, county roads, state highway networks, county boundaries, state borders, and things that we refer to as key points. And key points are nothing more than named locations on the route. So if you had, say, a construction site you're going to travel to and from frequently, then you could enter that location. We've got a separate tool called a Key Point Manager, which allows you to define these locations. And once defined, will show up in this list. So I'll start at the Pennsylvania border, or pardon me, end at the Pennsylvania border. So now I've defined a start location, an end location. I'll ask the system to analyze that trip for me. So at this point, it's finding a safe route of travel. It's looking at all the structures between those two locations. It's checking those structures for height. It's also performing a live load analysis for weight and all the bridges it travels on. And it's also checking for temporary and permanent restrictions. So this particular trip passed. We have 0 clearance failures, 0 load failures, and 0 restrictions. So in most cases, you would have entered that trip, it passed, and then you'd move on to the payment page. If you want more details about that particular trip, then you can expand this 4th panel down here. So it tells you the trip's passed, it's got a description for the trip, the length of the trip, and then a summary of the various clearance, load, and restriction failures. In this case, there are none. In addition to that, you're able to access various reports. One of our other design goals with Superload Connect Edition is to make things as configurable as possible. So much of what you see here today is a result of database entries. So we can configure, for example, what reports are displayed for a particular user by changing an entry in the database. I've logged in as a state user, and the way we've configured this is that state users have access to these 3 different reports. And in addition, you can display these reports differently. You can display them in their own tab, on the bottom or the right of the screen. So first I'll show the summary report, and I'll show it in its own window or tab. So this lists a summary of the analysis that was performed. The trip was 86 miles long. Here's the description, the number of bridges that were checked. This has a summary of the live load analysis that was performed in all those structures for travel on the bridge. And this is a dynamic report, so it's not a static page. You can actually, for example, filter. I'll look for any missing bridges. There don't happen to be any in this particular case. You can also sort by these columns. So here I'm sorting by rating factor. And you can select or filter by, for example, route ID. So the intent is to make this more than just a static summary of the trip traveled, but also a tool that you can use for further analysis. We have 2 other options, 2 other reports, and 2 different ways of displaying them. I'll show the clearance report later when I run another route, but for example, you can display these reports on the right-hand side as well. Or should be able to. I'm not sure why that didn't work. Let's try the summary report on the right. Maybe I've expanded here. Oh yeah, I was just too far off to the right. So this panel again is expandable. I'm just dragging it over to the side. So this is the summary report. It's displayed on the right-hand side of the screen. And you can collapse or expand that. So if I click that little arrow, it'll collapse, or I can grab it and expand it. In addition, we can display reports below. And the reason we have this is that sometimes some people like to see the results of the analysis at the same time they're viewing the map. So you can see all this at the same time you're viewing the route that was traveled. People that have, for example, 2-monitor configuration, they may want to see the report in a separate tab, and then they can drag that into another window, and then you can take advantage of the 2 full screens you have. So just trying to provide as much flexibility as possible in how we display these results. So I'll go back to the trip definition, and I'll show you another way of picking a trip. So I'll use that tool that I talked about before, so I can clear this trip just by clicking there. We previously entered a trip just by entering text locations. Another way, as I mentioned before, was to use just picking the trip on the map. So I'm going to pick along, I'll pick along I-70 here, and I begin by just picking a point on the map once I've selected the pick location. It highlights that particular segment of the route, and then it says, pick a point to complete the defining start location. So it needs to know, am I starting up here or down here? So I'll just start at this point. And then at this point, I can just continue to pick along. Oh, I'm sorry. I got a little confused there. So what I did there was I defined this trip by picking it on the map. So I picked a start location there, I picked an end location there, and now I can analyze from start to end. I got a little ahead of myself in my script there. So that's the second way of picking a location and using generator trip. The other way you can specify trip, I'll clear this one. So we first started with textual entry, which I showed here. I just showed how you can pick a location by picking on the map itself. And then the third way for defining a trip location is by using an address. So in this case, you just start typing the address. It'll display all the addresses in the state that have, for example, the number 14 in the address. And that list continues to drop down as you type. So I'm just continuing to type here. I'll pick East Churchville Road as an address. That's where the trip will start. So you can see that map has been zoomed to Churchville Road. And then for this demo, I'll use another address location. So I'm going to type 6. The address list gets filtered as I type this. And I'll pick this address on Sykesville Road. So now we have a start location, which was on East Churchville. We're going to end on Sykesville, and I'll just analyze from start to end. Okay, so we found a trip. One thing that's to note here is this trip started up here on Churchville Road, came down, stayed on the interstate, and then ended over here on Sykesville. It would have been shorter to go right to the city of Baltimore, but what's happened here is the trip has stayed on the interstate system. So one of the things you can do when you configure the system is you can define some preferences. So these are different preferences that are used when the trip is generated. And in this case, we've given priority to interstate travel. And because of that, the route skirted the city of Baltimore and the city streets and traffic and stayed on the interstate highway system. So that's generated trip. Once again, it's used when you know the start and an end for a trip and you want the system to determine the trip for you. I'd like to show you a second method of trip entry, and this is called enter a trip. And this is used when you know the trip you want to travel on. You just want the system to check that trip for you. So in this case, I know I want to start on Maryland Highway 4. So I'm going to pick Maryland 4, and I'll begin on Alton Street. So here you see Alton Street and Maryland 4. So this trip would have started on some, perhaps a construction site here on this city street or local road. We're going to start there and then enter the highway system on Maryland 4. We'll continue on going to US Highway 301. And then I'll choose to end this trip, and I'll end it on Maryland Highway 8. Okay, so we start here in Maryland 4, we're traveling to 301, ending on 8, And now I'll analyze that trip. Okay, so this trip succeeded as well. No clearance, no load, no restriction failures. Once again, you could expand this panel if you wanted to see the trip directions or get more information. But that trip worked as well. Now, the next method I'd like to show you is called pick a trip on the map. And this is what I thought I was showing you earlier. So using this method, you actually define the trip by picking points along the map. So you use the map itself to define the trip. And so, for example, I can just begin here. So if I knew the trip was starting on this highway, I would just click on the actual route where I wanted to start. It then says pick on either side of the start point to determine the trip direction. So it wants to know am I traveling south or north, so I'll pick here to say I'm going north. And then from here, all I need to do is continue picking points. And they don't need to be adjacent. It will just pick the points as you go. I picked a little too far ahead there. Whoops. Oh, I see. Maybe that's the point. We've got something wrong there. But once the trip is defined, then we can analyze that trip. And that trip succeeded as well. That trip, it may be the case that that route actually ends at that point. I'm not sure why I wasn't able to pick past that. So those are 3 trip definition methods. I showed you how to generate a trip, enter a trip, pick a trip on the map. I'd like to show you generate a trip one more time. So I'm going to do a border-to-border trip. I'm going to start on Interstate 68, and here I just type 68. And I'll go from the West Virginia border. And I'm going to travel on I-70, and it'll end at Pennsylvania border. So here's our start, here's our end, and then we'll analyze this trip. Okay, so this trip succeeded. There were no issues, no clearances, failures, no load failures, no restrictions. What I'd like to do is use the same trip, but use a different vehicle height. So I'm going to go back here and use the screen just to change the truck dimensions for this trip. It's 13.6. I'm going to change that to 16 feet and go back to the trip page. And because I have a trip already defined, when I return to the trip page, it will reanalyze that trip and then show the results of that analysis, but using a 16-foot high truck. And so what happened here was that we have a failure in this case. So we have 2 clearance failures. It's noted here there's 2 clearance failures. The 2 bridges are highlighted. If you want more information about those failures, you can hover over the symbol. It gives you the bridge ID, for example. If you want even more information about that failure, then you can click that symbol and you have the details for that particular bridge. In this case, you can see it's got a vertical clearance of 16 feet, which is why it failed. As I mentioned before, we tried to make things as configurable as possible. So the information that's shown here in the screen is configurable, and it's configurable by user. Some agencies don't want their users to view the vehicle height. Some are okay doing that. So the content of what you see here is configurable. So in this case, we had 2 bridge failures. It's easy just to hover and identify those. If you had a larger number of failures, then what you might want to do is use one of these reports instead. So I'll show you the clearance report. We haven't seen that yet. And I'll open this one in a new window. So here's the clearance report for the last trip that we traveled on. There's the trip directions, the length. Here are all the structures that were traveled. And once again, this is a dynamic report. So I could look at the failures. Here's the 2 bridges that failed, their structure IDs, their heights. We'll return and show all, and then we can filter on clearances and things like that. So once again, this is a dynamic report. So I'm going to go back and change my height back to 13.6. I don't want to have every trip failing. So change it back to 13.6, go back to the trip page, and then once again it'll reanalyze that trip. And this time we expect it to pass because we're using a shorter truck. Okay, that passed. So this is a border-to-border trip. It's on an interstate. This is the type of trip that you may want to reuse in the future. And so what you can do is decide to save this trip. And this is done under the Trip Commands panel. We have a Manage Save Trips option. And this displays a list of saved trips and categories. So it's much like you'd see in Windows Explorer, where you have folders and files. What we have are categories of trips. So we have this category called Everyone. So a trip that's saved in that category, if you have the right privilege, will be available to any user of the system. And then we also have individual categories. So I have a trip here called My Own, or a category called My Own, and any trip I save under that category will only be seen by myself. So, and then beneath that category, you can create your own categories. So yesterday I created a category called Tech Talk. I saved a couple of trips there. And then if I wanted to save this trip we have displayed, I would just click Add a Trip. And then I can give this trip trip name. So I'll just call this Trip from Today's Talk. Okay. So that trip's been saved. You can see it down here, and then now it'll be available to me the next time I return to the system. As I mentioned, I saved a couple trips yesterday. Here's one that I've saved. That's going to look very similar. Let's clear this trip. Go back to Load a Save Trip. So this is the 4th trip definition method. So I could, for example, recall this trip that I've saved before. Here's another trip that I've saved before. And I'll use this trip. So I've got this trip that I defined on I-68 from New Jersey over here to West Virginia. I recalled it, and now I can analyze that trip. So this just saves all the time needed to define a trip. I'm just recalling it. And for this trip, we see something a little bit different. You'll notice up here that we have some restriction failures, and they're highlighted by this color here. So I can click on the map at that location. It'll show me the restriction at that point. Otherwise, I can use the restriction report, which I haven't seen yet. And this time I'll choose to display that report on the right-hand side. So here we have it. Here's a list of all the restrictions, the 12 restrictions for this trip. We had 11 closed, 1 attribute restriction. Here's the detailed information for each restriction. And this is a pretty good example of why you may want to display that on the right-hand side with this vertical type report. You can see the map and restriction details at the same time. Okay, and then I can collapse that. So far I've shown you how to define a trip by entering it, by generating it, by picking it on the map, and how to load a trip. The final method It's what we call free-form entry. And this is, as I mentioned before, it's kind of the last resort. So it would be, you've tried to enter a trip, and perhaps because it's travel on a network, on a highway that's not in your highway system, you're not able to define that trip, and instead what you can do is enter that trip with text. You do that in this way. Here's a summary of the trip, and then here you can just add your own comments. Please end the trip near the gravel pit or whatever. Okay. And then with a free-form trip, what would happen is that trip would not be auto-issued. It would go into the permit office, they would review it, and then try to find you a safe trip to the gravel pit. And this text, you can also cut and paste that text. It's available for an email or whatever you need. That's a quick overview of the trip definition methods, the 5 different methods, the 3 different ways of locating trip definitions. We also have some tools, some support tools. These are listed here. I'll go through a couple of these. So say, for example, you wanted to locate a bridge in your system. You can't use this tool to do that. You just start entering the bridge number. It drops down. This is a type ahead list again. And I can pick a bridge. It'll place the symbol on the map. And then once again, you'll get this configurable list of attributes for that bridge. Let me go through another one. We have this find item tool. So say, for example, you wanted to use the method where you pick and trip along the map. You can use this tool to orient the map or locate the map to where you might want to start. So say, for example, I knew I wanted to start in Baltimore itself. So I could type that. If I typed it correctly. And then that locates me to the city of Baltimore. And if I wanted to start picking, then now I can start picking on route locations here. So it's just a way to center the map before you do trip definition. You can do the same thing with this find intersection tool. If I knew I wanted to start on I-70 and say I-270, then I could choose that from the map. It would center the map on that location. I could begin my trip definition there. So it's just a way to locate yourself on the map. The final thing I'd like to show you today is another tool. It's called Display Limitations. And what this allows you to do is it's like a visual analysis tool of your data. So what this allows you to do, for example, is to, well, I'll just show you rather than tell you. So I'm going to begin by selecting all counties in the state. I'm going to do clearance checking and hit Analyze. So this will check every structure you have in the state. It'll do a clearance check, and it'll check it using the currently defined vehicle height, which in this case is 13.6. So in the state of Maryland, there's 13 structures that will not pass a clearance of 13.6. And just as before, you can view these by hovering over the symbols and clicking them. We've got 13, so another way to do it would be to display that report. Same report that we saw before. And I can, for example, a little bit of delay there, show the failed structures, sort them by clearance. We have a 10-foot height bridge somewhere in Maryland. Okay, so this is used for some states. They have county-wide permits, and so they're able to select a particular county. They can evaluate that and see if that particular truck can travel within that county. I'll show you one more example. This is coming into a load rating analysis. And I'll just pick one county to do that, and I'll click Analyze. So this is a little more time-intensive process, more calculation involved. It's doing a live load analysis of every structure in Washington County, and it came back with 4 failures. So we can look at that report as well. I'll once again open it up in a tab. You have the option of opening it in the bottom window or the right. So let's look at that. So we actually found 627 bridges in that one county, Washington County. We performed a live load analysis on 354, and we had 4 structures which failed due to weight. And here's the details about those failures. That's about all I really wanted to show today, so thank you for your time.